يا إخوان وأخوات في الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
Dear brothers and sisters, before we begin, we request that everyone who has a cell phone or electronic device, please be sure to put it on silent or vibrate, inshallah ta'ala. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمد سيدنا وحبيبنا المصطفى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم ومن اتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ثم أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كلام الله وخير هدى هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر أمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this tremendous opportunity to gather for Yom Jumu'ah. And we ask that in this gathering that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will descend down upon us barakah. He will accept our worship. He will accept our good works. And he will afford us to make dua during the hour by which, when dua is made during that hour, between Asr and Maghrib, that it is not rejected. And we ask the believers to make dua for all of the Muslims around the world who are being subjugated and marginalized and oppressed. That we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the oppression and destroy the oppressors. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the oppression and destroy the oppressors. Ameen. Today, inshallah, before we get started, we're going to have a brief lesson in neuroscience. A brief lesson in neuroscience. And so neuroscience is the study of the brain and its functions. And one of the parts of the brain, if you remember from school, is called the amygdala. The amygdala. The amygdala is the region of the brain that is involved in processing emotions, particularly fear. It is the part of your brain that is involved in processing your emotions. And it says that the amygdala, that when it is triggered or when it becomes activated in response to perceived threats, then your body responds by developing safety mechanisms to protect you from harm. That your body responds. And so they call this, in this study, they call it the fight or flight response. So when you have an element of fear, that everything in your body changes. Your pulse rate increases. Your blood pressure goes up. And even the flood of your blood, the flow of your blood, it changes. You know that your blood goes from your limbs to your heart. But when your amygdala is activated because of fear or some type of external stimuli, then the flow of the blood changes that goes away from your heart into your limbs, and it gives you the energy that you need to fight or flight. So every time that is activated doesn't mean that a person is scared, but it generates something in your body that you will fight the thing because of that fear or you will flee from it. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already put this mechanism in place that all of these things happen before we even know anything about it, that we come equipped with it when we come into the world. And they even do studies that suggest that the amygdala is already operational while you're in the womb of your mother, that you're already learning about fight or flight. And so think about that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Sanurihim ayatina fil afaki wa fi anfusihim hatta yatabayyana lahum annahu al-haq. He says that we will show them our signs on the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear that this is the truth. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we only know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of his creation. We can never grasp the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we only can marvel and be in awe of what he has shown us in the creation. And oftentimes we can look to the galaxies, we can look to the universes, but many times we should look in ourselves and the wonders that have come through us. These things, these mechanisms that are in place automatically before we even have consciousness. And you know, people that study these things, they study neuroscience and the like, they attribute it to evolution. They say that we evolved into this. No, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created every single thing. One of his names is he is Al-Khaliq. He is the one who creates without a need, without any difficulty, without any effort, and put everything as it happens the way it's supposed to happen. A perfect design in creation. No flaws. And so when we study this about neuroscience and your amygdala and how it responds, this fight or flight response, think about that the next time you become scared. Think about the next time that you become fearful of something. Because the amygdala also stores anxiety as well. And so a person has to know how to develop it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that these things are by his design. And they also study, they say that fear is one of the earliest emotions that you will experience. Fear is one of the earliest emotions that a human will experience even in the womb of their mothers. And if you think about it for a moment, when you come out of the womb of your mother, you are crying because of fear of what can happen because you went from a place of security to a place of unfamiliarity. And then someone grabs you. And you don't know these things are taking place, but they are happening because of the mechanisms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in your brain. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already put your brain on Deen. He already put your mind on Deen when you are already extracted from the womb of your mother. And this is why a person has to go full blast with worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And everything that we engage in or we encounter, it is most likely that we will experience some level of fear or anxiety before we experience calmness or being confident. For instance, if you play sports, and even if you know you have the ability that you can shoot, that you can run or whatever, when it's game time, there's an element of fear that you might lose or you might not perform or you might get injured. And it's not fears of being scared to perform, but knowing that something could happen that is unknown to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put that mechanism in each and every one of us. And it is something that we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for, giving us the ability in ourselves to recognize fear, to recognize danger, because it doesn't mean you automatically become scared. It means that your body is on alert to protect you from harm. And this is a favor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you. without a need to do so. And think about the favors that we give back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes acting is that we're not scared of anything. Sometimes acting that we don't even fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so as we acknowledge this and think about it deeply, think about all the favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in your path. You know, they say that fear is an emotion that is indispensable for survival. Fear is an emotion that is indispensable for the survival. So you have to have a level of fear, a healthy level of fear, to help you motivate. Because fear is a motivator. When you're anxious about something, or you're fearful about something, or you're afraid of what be the outcome, it should prompt you to really think about what you're doing and then act accordingly. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you this mechanism as a favor to help you, to show you where you stand. Either you fight or you run. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us another emotion, which is called hope, or raja. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he created us and he gave us a balance. So it's not that we just go through life having fear or having anxiety, but then the other part we have what's called raja, having hopes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the great scholars of Islam, who was known as Hujjatul Islam, Imam Ghazali, he said that hope and fear, they are the wings of Iman. Hope and fear are the wings of Iman. And then the one who has them, they can fly. They can be free when they have a balance of hope and fear. And we believe between fear and hope, khawf and raja, that the believer, fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, punishing us according to what we earn, and hope that he will forgive us and accept us. In between that is where we try to really perfect our worship and perfect our character and follow in Islam truly, because that's where the success lies. And then the second part, we will have a discussion about the other part of having raja, having hope. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us this mechanism of fear already to help as a defense, as safety being in this world, to show us his signs, why he is great, why he is to be worshipped, why he is to be believed in, and why, incidentally, we should give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala our all, because he gave it all to us. And that's called shukr, having gratitude. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put mechanisms in your body to help you when you didn't even know your body parts. You know, it's no wonder that these things happen early, even before we're born. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that he has made for us hearing, sight, and fu'ada, and intellect. Being able to think, giving us a magnificent creation in the brain that they're still discovering things about it. And they even say, that people study it, that you only use 10% of it. Imagine if you activate 20%. Imagine all the people who are geniuses, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them a brain, and they don't even have enough sense to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why it's the favor of the believer that he is an exception. Because the believer, the Muslim, is the one who submits to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they have gratitude for every favor. Even in themselves as they recognize it. Even the abilities that they have, they thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in the second part, we will talk about this part of raja, or having hope. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه فإنه هو الغفور الرحيم. إن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. إن الله والملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. Brothers and sisters, we will talk briefly in the second part but it's a continuation of the first part. We talked about the part of the brain which is called the amygdala, and it is responsible for your emotions, and is responsible primarily for fear. And the other part that is responsible for is anxiety. Anxiety. So when your amygdala is triggered, you can become fearful and you can become anxious. And they also say in studies of the brain, they say that your amygdala can become overreactive, meaning that sometimes things that stimulate your amygdala for flight or fight response, sometimes they are not warranted. Meaning sometimes we may be scared to death and it's not even warranted. And just imagine if that happened in your life. Something scared you, something triggered, and there wasn't any danger, but your body automatically responded because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put this mechanism in place. But they say that the body, the amygdala can become overreactive. And that, when it becomes overreactive, it leads to stress, depression, and anxiety. And this when people, they don't know these things, and then they have to be diagnosed and they need help because they don't understand why they become anxious, why they have conditions like OCD and the like, because their amygdala is responding to things that seemingly afraid to them. And then other studies have shown that as you get older, your amygdala becomes less active. It automatically by itself becomes less active. So the more things that you are exposed to, the less you become afraid of them because it's already familiar. For instance, if you've been burnt one time and it triggers stress or anything in you or anxiety, it won't be the same thing that if it happens again, because your body is already familiar with that reaction. And so they say that naturally, that part of your brain automatically starts to be less fearful as you grow older. And they say that a person whose amygdala is less active as they get older, then they have a better psychological well-being. And it says that as you get older, it becomes less sensitive to fear. Now, how do we put that with Islam? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us these mechanisms that people are studying. And we might not know in and of ourselves, but now we think about it. Think about it as you get older. The things that triggered you earlier in your life, they don't trigger you the same. The things that you were scared of as a child, you shouldn't be scared of as an adult. And who teaches us these things? We don't come out of the womb and people tell us that there's going to come a time in your life you're not going to be afraid of this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it so. And so it's a natural occurrence that the older that you get, the less afraid, the less anxious you should be. And think how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you that as a favor. Why is it a favor? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us from the wombs of our mothers, brings us through this journey through life, and tells us that death is imminent. Every one of us is going to die. Kullu nafsin da'iqatul maut. Each and every soul will have a taste of death. They will experience. No one is exempt. And look how he makes the transition easy. He already put in your mechanism in your body, in your biological functions, that as you get older, you're less afraid of death. And when you couple it with the man that he gave you as a favor, he chose you to be Muslim, then you cultivated that you actually become less fearful of things. And think about the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were people, they weren't fearing anything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was reported about them that when they faced an enemy, the enemy used to say that these are people who love death more than you love life. They love death more than a person would love life. And why was that? Because in their development of Iman, being servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and being in the presence of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, they were fearless. That doesn't mean when they engaged in battle, they didn't have some anxiety. They didn't think about that they wouldn't win. They would think about if they would be killed or not. But they came to a conclusion that it was for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it didn't matter. And so as we develop in our Islam, the only thing that is incumbent upon us is to make sure we develop Iman. Because when your Iman is sound, it makes fear go away. When your Iman is sound, it makes depression go away. When your iman is sound, it makes stress and anxiety go away. And so that means you have to give your all to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's no coincidence that in these studies, we learn from the divine revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala where he says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَأَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ لَهُمْ أَجْرَهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. That those who believe and they do righteous actions and they establish the salat and they give their zakat, لَهُمْ أَجْرَهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. There is a reward with them from their Lord. And the scholars have explained that reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Jannah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. There will be no fear, no khawf for them, nor will they be stressing. So as that mechanism that he put, that's instilled in us, that automatically we will have a sense of fear, of danger, anxiety. It won't be any of that. And every time we engage and we endure it and we overcome it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah, it will be gone. And he mentions it after he says that there will be a reward for them, an ajr. There will be a reward for them. La khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. And so what is that telling us? That deal with stress, deal with anxiety, deal with all of these things that life has to offer and overcome them. Don't become swallowed up by them. Your body automatically will have a sense of danger, a sense of anxiety. And if your amygdala is not worked on, if it's activated too much, then you will have depression, stress, sorrow, and delight. And how many people we know get stuck in these emotions? How many people are stuck where they are and they can't make advancement? And the way out is Iman. The way out is Iman, turning it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inna alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Having sound Iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and doing all of those things that will activate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being pleased with you. Then establishing prayer, giving charity, all of these things that we have a problem with. A lot of times when people are overcome with depression, overcome with anxiety, they're stressing, they don't know how to get through the life. One of the things that Shaitan will do to manipulate them, they'll stop praying. They'll turn away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They'll turn to all of these other things. And then it will lead them in the sunken place. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is already telling us, he created us with this element of fear. He created us with these elements of anxiety and depression. And it is upon us, he gave us the ability to overcome them with Iman. And that's why the Muslim, he gives us everything for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a Muslim becomes Muslim, not just when they take Shahada, but when they recognize who they are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his slave. Sometimes being Muslim is word of mouth only. But when the Muslim recognizes who he is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is a lowly servant trying to earn Allah's pleasure at every single moment. And then he starts to take care of his amygdala on his own. He's not responsive to fear and stress and anxiety. Why? Because Iman is taking the place of it. His faith is being developed that he's no longer fearful. He's not anxious about the tomorrow. He's not worried about how he's going to earn his living. He's not worried about all these things because the only things that matter is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The only thing that matters is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees us and how worthy we are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instead of trying to be worthy in the eyes of other people who lead us to stress, a lot of the things that we try to accumulate and do is because of other people. We let them trigger us in ways that are unhealthy. And we're not even going to talk about how stress and depression and anxiety has an impact on your health, on your physical health. These emotions have an impact on your physical health. It shortens your lifespan. And so what is the solution? What is the cure? Iman. Not just, it's translated as faith, but Iman means to having a secured awareness, safety with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he will take care of your every affair. It's not for you to know how it's going to be. It's not for you to know the outcome. It's not for you to envision how things are supposed to be. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of it. He put you in a position so you can always turn to him. That's for the one, when they have Iman, that's how you know. it becomes easy to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in times of difficulty, in times of sorrow, in times of sadness, in times of anxiety. The believer who recognizes his work with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will work on it, and then automatically the fear is doing on its own. Even people who are not Muslim, you hear older people, they start thinking about their demise from this worldly life, and they don't care. Talk to some elderly folks. You never hear them talking about things like they're scared to die. And they don't know what the outcome is. And we know our outcome could possibly be in hell as believers. It's possible. We have to be less afraid of that and have more hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as Allah removes the hopes from you naturally, biologically, through neurological functions, he removes the anxiety from you. Then you take the opportunity to replace it with Iman. Because Iman is our responsibility to build it, to perfect it, to increase it, and to protect it from doubts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you the most exclusive gift. La ilaha illallah. It is a treasure that is uttered on your mouth, believed it in your heart, and worked by your body limbs. The best thing you can ever receive. It didn't cost us a dime. And if we had to work for it when it was given to us, we wouldn't have earned it right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us every opportunity to build on that La ilaha illallah. And then the Prophet ﷺ told us, he said that every person was created upon the fitrah. They're upon the natural disposition to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't take much cognitive strategy to realize that all of this didn't happen out of nowhere. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it so. And because of that, we are thankful and dutiful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And every time we give ourselves sincerely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of those things that are plaguing us and holding us down, they're removed. And studies have shown that some of it is automatically removed biologically. Just by you being a human being. The older you get, the more that your mind realizes that this life is coming to an end. And Allah gives you the ability to accept it. You don't find people in their elder age really crying about death. The only people who cry about it think that they're supposed to have a whole life, a prosperous life, a rich and luxurious life. That is deception. But the believer knows that this could very well be their last moment on earth. And when the Iman is sound, they are ready to go. When the Iman is sound, they are ready to go. Because they know what the outcome is. That they have raja, they have hopes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be pleased with them because they did their due diligence. They did their prayers. They fasted. They established the salat. They gave charity. They were kind to their neighbors. They forgave. They overlooked. All of these things that we learned from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Brothers, move up close, inshallah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you that recognition and that realization that your return is to him. And so this dunya almost is like nothing. And you read reports about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he was asked, what do I have to do with this world? He said, I'm just like a traveler who's traveling and take a shade under the tree for a minute, and then I continue my journey until it ends. That's the dunya. We're on the journey and it's going to end. It's not going to get greater all the time. Don't let those things have us sorrowful, have us full of anxiety, have us depressed, thinking about the dunya. Look what's happening around the world, in the country. There's nothing but despair. There's nothing but destruction. All of these things were prophesied by the Prophet ﷺ. Because having Iman is not just believing in Allah, believing in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and believing in him more than anybody else, loving him more than anybody else, that he is more dear to us than anybody that we've ever known. And that's where our heart is, with the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he showed us how to get through this. Wasn't the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam a walking Quran? As his wife said when she was asked about his behavior, she said, "Kana khuluquhu al-Quran." His behavior was the Quran. When you read the Quran, when you read these ayats, وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, that is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. No fear, no stress, ready to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and using the dunya to prepare. Don't let this dunya make us lose our ability to prepare for the akhirah. That we bog down with work and bills and family and stress and all of these things. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ensuring us, after getting a reward from him for setting up ourselves to be dutiful to him, then there will be no fear, no worry, no stress, no sorrow. That means in this life, there's going to be some. There may be a lot. But when you work on Iman, those things go away. When you work on perfecting your worship, all of those things that are trivial, they go away. So give your energy to Raja. Give your energy to having hopes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept us. Give your energy to the hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make us inhabitants of Jannah. And give your energy to the hopes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recognize us on Yom Qiyamah as being his worthy servants. Ameen. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us any shortcomings. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to overlook our faults. رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّكَ رَبِّ الْعِزَّةِ عَمَّا يَصِفُونَ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَى الْمُرْسَلِينَ وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ.